Welcome to the fifth day of the Innovation for International Development Expo. I am Diana Harbison, Assistant Director for International Development in the Global Engineering Programs and Partnerships Office here at Purdue. I'd like to remind everyone that we're recording, so we invite you to have your camera on. We began the expo 2 weeks ago, hosting student-focused events where experts spoke about career opportunities and we announced the winners of our poster competition. We want to congratulate all of our students for an amazing job on their poster. The expo resumed on Monday, where we heard from our Seed Grant semifinalists who presented their innovations to overcome challenges that field partners like World Concern, SEWA, and Catholic Relief Services identified. Yesterday, my colleague hosted a panel to talk about needs assessments and human-centric design. Today, we will discuss iterative implementation and adaptation. Tomorrow, we will have a panel discussion on scaling for impact. These 3 days of panel discussions are meant to build on each other and give us a chance to share best practices and trends that we see in the work we do. The expo will end on Friday, where we will announce grant funding winners. Dean Mung and the Shaw Lab benefactor Manu Shaw will attend that event and deliver some remarks. We encourage you to register for the rest of the events this week. My colleagues can drop the registration link into the chat box for your easy reference. As mentioned, we are talking about iterative implementation and adaptation today. Our speakers are Dr. Michael Wolcock, lead social scientist in the Development Research Group at World Bank, an adjunct lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. His research focuses on strategies for enhancing state capability and crafting more effective interaction between informal and formal justice systems. He also spent time in Malaysia establishing the World Bank's first global knowledge and research hub. Emily Janok, Director of Knowledge Management and Learning for CARE USA, focuses on learning from programming and using that learning to improve impact, specifically eradicating poverty through empowering women and girls. She has field experience in West Africa, published a number of academic articles, and is especially interested in community-led development. Deidre Fair-James is director in the Finance, Investment, and Trade Group at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC. Prior to that, she was resident country director for Ghana's second MCC Compact, a 5-year, $500 million program. Quick note about Millennium Challenge Corporation that despite its name, it's actually a US federal government agency. Prior to joining MCC, she was at the International Finance Corporation, and before that, Owens Corning as a structural engineer. But most importantly, she's a Boilermaker. She's a Purdue Civil Engineering graduate. Rajani Shrestha is Director of Global Education at World Learning. She oversees their $190 million education development portfolio, grounded in strengthening the educational system, improving instructional quality, and formal and non-formal learning environments. She has over 15 years of experience working in complex, fragile, conflict-affected countries. She's also worked at the Asian Development Bank and with UNICEF. A quick note about World Learning: Purdue and World Learning have partnered a few times on proposals to funders like USAID. In one instance, we were awarded a Department of State funding to work together to support faculty development in Iraq. So if there are Purdue faculty interested in partnering with World Learning or any of the other organizations participating in the expo, please let me know, as it's one of the reasons we host events like this. As for all the amazing Purdue students, I encourage you to contact the speakers and participants we have hosted this week. We target these organizations with you in mind, so we expect you to use these opportunities to build your network. So let's start the panel for today. We'll take about 30 minutes to pose a few questions to our panelists, who will take turns in responding and sharing their experiences. We'll then take the rest of the time to interact with our audience and invite questions. And audience interaction is what we're really going for today, I think. With that, let's begin quickly talking about what iterative implementation and adaptation mean. A simple Google search defines it as an approach used in software development. Simple start to implementing something that gains more complexity and a broader feature set as it continues toward the final system completion. The Center for International Development at Harvard says it's a step-by-step approach that helps break down the problem into its root causes, identify entry points, search for solutions, take action, reflect upon what you have learned, adapt, and then act again. In a prior life, I used to explain iterative implementation and adaptation as FAIL, which most people have seen by now. FAIL could stand for first attempt in learning. I did not encourage my program teams to seek out failure, but I wanted everyone to acknowledge what we already knew, that failing lends itself to adaptation and eventual progress or variations of success. This helped create an open environment where people were willing to talk about what was and wasn't working in their programs rather than talking about things through rose-colored glasses. So we could all work together to overcome those challenges. But enough about what Google and I have to say. Let's find out what this means in the real world. So panelists, if you could, please share with us, what is iterative implementation and adaptation? What does it mean for each of you in your work and to your organizations? Let's first start with Emily at CARE.
Thanks so much for inviting me today. When we talk about iterative implementation and adaptation, we often use the language.
Emily, we have a little bit of feedback in the audio. Sorry.
Is that any better?
Much better. Perfect.
All right. Sorry about that. So at CARE, when we talk about adaptive, iterative adaptation and implementation, we often talk about adaptive management, but they're very much the same idea of you start something small, you test it, you see what's working and what's not. Some of the things we know we have to do very carefully about that in the work that we do as a humanitarian and development implementer is make sure that we are the ones who bear the risk if something doesn't work. So how do we do this in partnership with the communities we serve? How are we really listening to their experiences and their feedback about what works and prioritizing that? There's always the question of who does it work for? And if it works great for us, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's working. So how do you build in that space? How do you build in mechanisms to listen to communities? Because they know if something is working or not. And they will tell you if you ask and if you then react and listen, if you help solve the problem. So how do we set up those spaces to do this with more participant feedback and think more about what is working and who bears the risk when it doesn't work? And thinking about setting up mechanisms to make sure that the people who have to do extra work if it breaks is us and not somebody else is something that we have to be really careful about when we think about this. One of the other pieces that we're really working on is how do you do this more quickly and with more rapid cycles? So there is often in international development this idea of, well, it's a 5-year project and 5 years from now, we will know if it worked or not. We'll design something and then we will get an evaluation back and it will either say thumbs up or thumbs down. That's not fast enough. That's 5 years. You could have been doing something better if you were paying more attention. A lot of times that means we have to be willing to work with imperfect data, that we're not going to get the perfect version of a statistically bulletproof sample that tells us everything we would ever want to know. We have to work with other kinds of information. And how do we do that? And how do we prioritize what information is? Numerical data in a large sample size is only one kind of data. It is only one source of information that tells you how things are going. The last thing I would say is that we're very much working on how do we do this more proactively? So you don't wait until something breaks or something fails to see how you could get better. How do we deliberately check to see if things are going better before they're already so far off the rails that it triggers some part of our monitoring system or some part of our idea? And how do we test things that we know have worked in a different place, but are in a new context or with a new group of people? And how do we think about that being a lot more proactive and pushing towards more efficient, more impactful work, even if we're not getting a signal that it's broken, right? Even if it's just, well, it's performing okay, but we think we could be better. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Rajani, what does iterative implementation mean for world learning?
Diana, first, can you see me? I can't see you. I couldn't see Emily either.
We can see and hear you great.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, thank you for this opportunity, Diana. I'm going to talk about our experience with the Lebanon project. So let me just start with just the overall context, just to put in perspective of why we, how the external environment impacted the project implementation and how and why we dived into the adaptive management and what it means for us. So the project Kitabi 2, it operates throughout Lebanon, a country with so much resilience and potential, but also one that is going through daily uncertainties. When the project was awarded in April 2019 by USAID, I think it was written in a very different context than what we are facing today. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the context. I'll just go back very briefly to July 2019. That's really when the financial situation was starting to deteriorate in Lebanon. There was a shortage of liquidity in US dollars. And then because of the financial situation, there was a civil unrest in October 2019, which we call the political uprising. And the situation wasn't as bad as it is today, because in October 2019, just to give you a perspective, $1 US was equivalent to about 1,500 Lebanese pound. Today, in the black market, it is trading at around 12,000 Lebanese pound. Because of the civil unrest, it had a huge impact on our project. It was like the startup phase for the project. We had planning activities to do, but the ministry officials were not available. We also had schools that were just sporadically open. And then COVID happened. Everyone is online. The ministry is not prepared. And then to add to the stress, we had the Beirut blast, which was in August, which destroyed 183 schools. So there was so much that was happening in the context, and the context was so volatile and unpredictable that adapting, like Emily said, adaptive management was just something that we had to do, and was part of the implementation process. So what does it mean for World Learning and for Kitabi? It is about being intentional. It's about being proactive, and it's about being systematic, and making those changes in the programmatic and those programmatic adjustments, based on information and changes in the context, which we do through context monitoring. Oftentimes, even when we've talked about within the team about adaptive management, it's not about changing the goal. That is where the red line is, the goal stays, but really about changing the path to getting the goal, getting to the goal. And so overall, the goal and the objective of this adaptive management really is to reduce the uncertainty over time.
Thank you. Deidre, what does it mean for MCC?
Sure. So I thought maybe it might be helpful if I just kind of do 15 seconds in terms of what is MCC. So even though we're not new, we've been around 17 years, a lot of people may not be familiar with us. So as Diana mentioned, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, or MCC, is a US government organization. We were created in 2004 to provide large grants to developing countries for poverty reduction and economic growth. And since our founding, we've approved over $13 billion in grants. The average size of a grant is usually between 350, 400 million, sometimes as large as 500 million. And these grants have supported projects in multiple sectors: agriculture and irrigation, finance and enterprise development, transportation, power, education, health services. And one of the reasons why we've had this kind of wide diversity of sectors is that we start from a premise of country ownership. And so when I was reading the definition of implementation adaptation, it really, rang true for me in terms of it starts with that strong country ownership piece, and really grounding the programs and looking at what are those binding constraints to poverty reduction and economic growth, and what are the potential solutions in a country-led approach. And so for us, what we start with when countries become eligible is they set up a team in country, and then we work with them, but they lead a process of defining those constraints, and that's an iterative process that the country goes through to see if it's power focus or health or education, and then they conduct a root cause analysis once they decide. So maybe it's power, to understand, well, what are the problems with reliable power? And they make sure that there's a diverse group of actors that are consulted, public, private sector, urban, rural, to really bring in the stakeholders that understand this problem best from their lived experience. And so there's this iterative process of a lot of times going down this tree to see is it more generation? And then if they find that, okay, it is more generation, but actually that's the reason there's no generation is it's being caused by this issue over here in terms of the utility not paying their bills. And so nobody wants to come and generate more power for a utility that's not paying their bills. And then saying, okay, maybe we need to go and revisit this problem. So it's this constant, even before we get to implementation, even during design process of really trying to understand the problems, the root causes, and designing our programs around that. And the tension is often, is the ability to not do this forever, to not get trapped in an iteration and design and discussion and analysis doom loop. One of the things about our program is that we usually have about you have about 2 to 3 years to develop the program, and then we have 5 years, and that's statutory to implement. And so even if the road is not finished on day one, 5 years, shovels down. Now, COVID has been an exception because for the first time, like ever, our countries that are in implementation have received an extension. So, so in terms of the design piece, that's what implementation and adaptation means for us. Now, in terms of the implementation, there are some other challenges there that we have because of our timeline and the finite amount of resources that we have for program. And I can talk a little bit later about how we've been trying to deal with these challenges of now implementing in a more iterative and adaptive approach.
Thank you. So Michael, you want to bring us home to give us a full understanding of what iterative implementation and adaptation is?
Thanks, Diana, and thanks to everybody for including me in the conversation today. The principles you laid out and that Emily, Rajani, and Deidre have spoken are all great. So that's what it is. I'm just going to back up a little bit and say that when I and my colleagues first articulated what we call problem-driven iterative adaptation, a strategy for thinking about these issues in a slightly more formal way, the issue sort of wasn't just coming up with another toolkit for development because there's a zillion of those. It was really a more concerted effort to try and think about how to enhance capability for policy implementation. So at one sort of meta level, the challenge was how does anybody in development really go about trying to enhance the effectiveness of the systems that are charged with turning policy into lived experience. And much of our mental energy in the chattering class space is obsession with policy, my policy versus your policy, and this is better than that. And very little attention given to how or whether it's the prevailing administrative system that's charged with turning this policy, whatever it is, into reality can actually do that task. And once you start from there, then there's all sorts of reasons why the prevailing system may or may not be able to do the work asked of it. But when there are challenges or struggles in that particular space, the prevailing way in which the large multilateral organizations tend to think about this, and this is a product of their own prevailing institutional logic and the way in which they're set up and the dispositions of the kinds of people that get hired to work in these places, is to largely think about organizational capacity issues in terms of 3 T's. One is the problem of technology, whether the reason these kids aren't doing well in school is because they're not using the latest technology. So if we introduce new technology, this will help to expand and improve kids' learning. And so the famous or infamous laptop in every village program from Peru, for example, is a canonical example of someone deciding that. So we can short circuit this whole upgrade in organizational effectiveness if we can just get a laptop to every single kid in a school in Peru. That was predictably enough with hindsight, just something that didn't work. Okay, well, so we tend to think about it in terms of technology. Another way we tend to think about it is in terms of training. Well, we just need to give people more training sessions, and we're good at that. We know how to hire a hotel for a day, give people per diems, put them in a classroom for a couple of days and teach them how to use this new software or how to use some new procedure that's been introduced. But those particular approaches tend to focus very strongly on individuals and see it as a sort of a cognitive task of helping people to acquire skills that they didn't have before. The third T is transfer. We sort of think, well, we're scouring the world for a best practice that can short circuit that learning process. And if someone somewhere elsewhere in the world has done something and it's been verified by some nice rigorous evaluation study, then it then acquires this status of being something that works, capital T, capital W. And then we transfer it, and we imagine that the problem is corruption, we just need to find the world's best anti-corruption law. And if we introduce that, then we believe somehow that the work that is needed to be done to reduce corruption will be done now by this best practice legal document that we've just introduced. So those three T's are the ways in which the prevailing administrative structures of international development, at least in the multilateral space, tend to function. And the concern that my colleagues and I had was that maybe there is a certain class of problems for which that is exactly the right way to think about how to deal with challenges. I think there's only a finite number of ways in which you deal with hyperinflation, for example, and that the effectiveness of central banks around the world has increased over the last few decades precisely because there was some technology training and transferring that enabled that particular kind of problem to be addressed in that particular kind of way. But that's just so seductive to people like us, right? We desperately want problems to be like that because that makes us feel smart. It makes us feel validated in our nice degrees that we have. It justifies staying in nice hotels and flying at the front end of the plane to get there. All of our sensibilities are built around that kind of logic. But if you're dealing with problems that are in the social work space, for example, how to reduce domestic violence or how to consolidate peace agreements and all these kind of challenges, then just thinking that, or instinctively thinking that the challenge really can best be resolved by some combination of technology transferring and training is just going to bounce out of the space in which you enter it. And so if one is going to have a different kind of set of tools for dealing with different sets of problems, different kinds of problems, then we needed a different approach to thinking about how to build organizational capability and thinking about how to refashion and repurpose these broader ideas around iteration and adaptation and seem to us to be a very promising way forward with that. And in a very circumscribed kind of way, I think we've been able to do that over the nearly 10 years now that we've articulated this. But I just conclude this particular remark by saying I don't want people to take away from this that the World Bank now sort of turns on this kind of approach. It's still fundamentally constitutionally structured to do the three T's. That's what it was designed to do. That's what that's how it deals with roads and irrigation and all the other big structural problems that it deals with in development. It's just going to be a long, challenging process to figure out how to expand the space for thinking about what kinds of problems we are confronting, and then how we can create for helping other people to nominate and prioritize their problems rather than thinking that our job is to waltz in and tell people what their problems are. And again, that's a very different kind of professional disposition that is just not how we're trained to think. It's not how we want to think because it makes us very vulnerable. It makes us look weak. We want to be doctors. We want to be roll in, tell me 5 things that's wrong with you, and I'll tell you what the problem is. And this isn't medicine, it's social work. It's figuring out how to engage constructively in a really difficult and awkward and power structured context to be part of the problem and not part of the solution.
Thank you. And you remind me of a story of a psychologist friend who did some work in Nepal and always approached issues of mental illness thinking that her psychology could be the fix, when in fact somebody who was sad, their cow died and they just needed a new cow. So she learned very quickly that psychology and her practices were not always the answer. Sometimes the answer is a lot simpler than that.
That's a really good example, yeah.
So can we talk a little bit more about mechanically with examples and deirded steps of how this is done? And since it's quite different for the World Bank and MCC versus CARE and World Learning, let's start with Deidre at MCC. If you could talk a little bit more in detail about how this is done.
Sure. So, maybe going back to the example that I gave in the opening, that when we start off this process, and again, it's usually about a 9 to 12 month process of identifying, working with the team to identify the constraint. So let's say it's power, and then getting all the people in the room that work the utilities, the consumers, businesses, think tanks, NGOs, in the country, and then we can come back and fly back and forth, and we bring our experts to try and listen and understand what are those root causes. So you literally, sometimes people use I'm not sure if people are familiar with fishbone diagrams. Sometimes people use fishbone diagrams. We actually use something that looks more like an org chart in terms of the root cause analysis. We'll have power, and then you'll have a generation branch and a regulation branch and an institutional branch. But then you find, the utility, for instance, distribution, issues. And then often you find, just as you think you're starting to kind of get down to understanding the root cause, you talk to another set of stakeholders, because maybe you've talked to the people in the Ministry of Power, and they say, well, these are the problems. We're the Ministry of Power, we know. And then you sit and you talk with the people in the utility, and they will say, actually, we're the ones at the cold face. These are the problems. And so then you're switching that around. And so every time you talk to a different stakeholder, you're going to get a different perspective. And this is where it gets difficult. As Michael was saying, it's not Diana knows I'm an engineer, and I sometimes when I do this work, I'm just like, I want the answer. Like, tell me you need to upgrade, this transmission line. But that's not it. It is a lot of times, you have political considerations, institutional considerations, considerations around why people make certain decisions that they do, and it's not always technical. There are underlying, reasons, sometimes self-interest. Again, it could be given the political situation. So you're trying to figure out, and it's hard to say truth, because again, depends on your perspective and where you're coming from, especially if, for instance, if you talk to consumers. And so, not to get too much in the weeds, but we do spend quite a bit of time really trying to drill down and understand what the root cause is. But at the end of the day, even with, for instance, our program in Ghana was $500 million, you still can't do everything, because often these sectors, again, whether it's transportation or whether it's health, you need billions of dollars, even though $500 million, may be a lot. And so really having a tough conversation about where can we enter as a program. We have 5 years. As a government organization, there is, we don't want to crowd out the private sector. So we don't want to enter into a space where potentially, other actors could come in and do a better job and a more sustainable job than we can. So it's having those tough conversations about not only what is the problem, what can we actually address, and then the best actor to that can address this problem. And so it's one of the more challenging parts of the conversation, and maddening, because just when you think you have it, you talk to somebody else, you've been doing this for a couple of weeks, and then you talk to another group and they have, a revelation.
Uh-oh, we just lost Deidre. I was afraid of that. But government computers are not always friendly to Zoom, so that's why she's on. She's on remote, so I'm sure she'll plug back in. Let's carry on, Michael, if you wouldn't mind sharing in greater detail, specifically the steps that we engage with doing this work.
Sure. I think the key part for us, well, there's many key parts, but the first key part is authorization, right? You have to be, as a bilateral or multilateral agency in our case, you are there at the host government's pleasure, and you don't start messing with all of this iterative and adaptive stuff until you're invited to do so, until you're authorized to do so. In part because of the reasons that others have already mentioned, that the process entails failing. It entails, or at least deep disappointment or time that we wish we didn't have to spend. Right? It's way better to think, well, I'm so smart, I can tell you in an hour what the problem is. And it's like, well, many of these kinds of problems we're dealing with, it can take weeks or months sometimes to actually do the root cause analysis that we were just mentioning. So you have to be given the space to do that, and you have to be protected in that space for doing that kind of work. So it's not. And I can't stress how important that is. This is not about sort of rogue agents within an organization suddenly smuggling in a new technology and watching their awesomeness unfold. Right? You do it in full transparency, and you say, "We've seen this movie before. Here are the 3 T's. When you're struggling with the implementation challenges before you, you can hire McKinsey and you can hire a bunch of other multilateral agencies or whatever to do this kind of work. And here's what it's going to look like. Here's a bunch of studies that can be pretty reliably foretell, if you haven't lived through this experience already, how this is going to turn out." And that's how the world should have anticipated the response to the one laptop in every village or every household thing from Peru. Doesn't have to end like that, we don't think. There could be an alternative. Here's what one alternative to that looks like. It's not going to guarantee that you get a beautiful outcome. It's going to get an outcome. We like to think we're going to collectively wager that it's going to be a better outcome than what the 3 T's would get you. Your call. If you're strong enough and brave enough and hanging around long enough to give this a chance, we'll be in it with you, and we'll try and help you create and protect a space for going through this iterative and adaptive process. And it will last as long as you allow us to last. And that's the deal. And people have to be fully aware of what that entails. So at the moment, we're doing something like this in Cambodia, for example. We've actually set up a whole online training course for several hundred of their senior public administrators. And we originally were going to do this in a more traditional in-person format. We have to spend months and months and months turning all of this into an online task. But the essence of it remains, this program can be taught to people, to senior officials in Cambodia, because the minister in charge authorizes it and has been persuaded that I've seen this movie enough times. I know how it will end if we just double down on what we've already been doing. We've got enough hints from and enough historical evidence and experiences from elsewhere in the world that suggest this might be a better way. Let's give it a shot. And so that's what we're doing. And we try to be as clear as we can be upfront about, look, I'm not selling you a new magic potion. If you take this, wonderful things are going to happen. It's going to take real work, and it's going to take very different kind of work to what you might be used to as a senior administrator, where you think your job is to just make big decisions and tell people what to do. You've got to be in there with everybody on this. You've got to recognize that it's really hard to go through a diagnostic process. To fill out the details of those fishbone diagrams is going to lead to argumentation. People are going to push back against it. It's going to feel like an endless rabbit warren where one hole just leads into another one. And yeah, it is. That's what these situations are like. That's what these kinds of problems are like. And that's what you've got to help people to understand up front, so that when things get hard, when the difficult conversations emerge midpoint and everybody's suddenly freaking out and thinking, oh, geez, is this gone off the rails completely? Are we actually going to solve this? People don't just throw in the towel and think the 3 T's sounds way better. Let's just hire some fancy person, throw a lot of money at it, but if it works, great. And if it doesn't, then we can blame them. So, being transparent and clear about what this actually entails is the essence of it. And if you're just another snake oil salesman, then you'll get the snake oil results.
Thank you. So Emily and Rajani, we'll hear from you next about how this work is done mechanically, but I want to sprinkle in an audience question that's actually quite relevant if you're comfortable incorporating that in your answer. But the audience, a wonderful grad student, Luke, he's asked actually, what happens when the problem you're facing is outside the scope of your own expertise and abilities? What do? Do you bring in another expert? Do you learn yourself? Do you just move on to another problem? So how do you kind of build that into the mechanics of how you're doing this? Emily, if you wouldn't mind starting.
Yeah, and it is one of the questions that when
we got that feedback. Emily, we got that weird feedback.
Any better now?
Yeah, thanks.
All right, I just have to unplug and replug in my headphones every time. That's a fun game. So, and when Deirdre was talking, I thought about all of the times I've been in one of those problem exercises and got to the end and realized that we were trying to boil the ocean. We were trying to solve all the problems in the whole system all at the same time with a tiny little grant and like 10 people. That's not going to work. You do, to Luke's question, you have to sort of pick the chunk that you think you can do constructively and where you think you're the best actor to do it. You know, Deirdre said it earlier, we're not the right answer to every problem. Our organization, our expertise, that combination of staff in that project can't solve everything. They're not the best team for every problem in the world. So finding the problem that you can solve constructively, where you have something to contribute and where you're not crowding out somebody else who is better positioned or who will have a better solution than you are, is really important. So sometimes, Luke, to your question, that means you have to think about a different problem to solve, and you have to renegotiate what actually you think you're solving. Sometimes it means you bring in another expert or you do more learning. And one thing I would say is, certainly for CARE, is how do you learn from who's already out there and what's already happened? There are people all over the world doing these problem exercises and these problem trees and producing amazing reports with lots of data. Start there. Don't start every time like it's a clean slate and you're the only person in the world who has ever thought about this, because I guarantee it's not true. And so how do you learn from others, and how do you build that into some of the work that you do? And it's one of the questions that we ask CARE all the time when we get started. The first question is, well, who else has already tried to solve this problem and what do they know about it? And often that also includes starting with the communities, starting with the people who are experiencing the problem. That if you start by hiring the McKinseys or the research firms of the world, they're going to tell you a version of the problem. They're not going to tell you the same version of the problem that the woman who doesn't have power in her house and therefore can't accomplish a set of things that she wants, they're not going to tell you the same problem. So we build a lot of sort of participatory learning exercises and thinking about how do we work with women in communities to understand what's happening here. Part of what we did during the COVID response, particularly in the universe where we couldn't suddenly send out a bunch of enumerators to administer surveys and get to the truth, is we started just making phone calls. We started sending WhatsApp messages to women that we worked with and saying, talk to us about what's happening here. What is your biggest problem today? What do you need right now? And then how do we as CARE try to answer that problem, as opposed to saying, we know what the problem is, we are the expert, and we've defined the problem. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. We had sort of, as a globe, defined the problem as a hand washing soap problem in the first, if you remember back to the first month of COVID, that's what it's stay at home and wash your hands. That's what we had decided the problem was. And every woman CARE spoke to said, that's all well and good, but I can't feed my family. And I'm not going to let my family starve because we don't have soap in the house. Like, it's just not a trade-off I'm willing to make. We had to think differently, not just about the solution, but about the problem. I will end by saying the best piece of advice anyone has ever given me about how to do this work and how to think about, well, call up the woman and ask her, call up 15 women and ask them, was let go of the idea of yourself as an expert. You are not an expert. You are in customer service. Your job is to help them solve the problem they are facing. And until you let go of the idea that you are the expert who knows the truth, you will always be wrong. And that I think about that basically every day as, how do I let go of myself as the expert and think about myself as the customer service agent?
Thank you, Emily. And I've often daydreamed of having a customer service expert come speak. So maybe that's our next panel, Purdue audience. Rajani, would you mind wrapping us up on this point of how we do this, and if you're comfortable responding to Luke's question?
Yeah. Just building off what others have said, really, it's really about not thinking that you are the expert. These problems have been experienced by others. There are solutions out there. I'm taking the lens of Lebanon and the specific project Kitabi, which is aimed at improving learning outcomes in reading and math. But there are certain parameters from the donors, and sometimes there may be a new problem, or oftentimes what we face is at the ministry level, we are working with the public sector, and I think someone said, it's also about authorization. You can't just go and do iterative planning and just keep changing. But sometimes those kinds of requests can come from the ministry's end as well. And but oftentimes it's about just making sure that, ultimately, does whatever solutions or whatever issues that the ministry is raising or solutions that they're asking for, does it meet the project's goal? And the overall goal is to improve learning outcomes. If it doesn't, then really we would not entertain that. It's probably another project that can solve it. But if it is, broadly is able to meet that overall goal, and that's what we did during COVID, when we pivoted from face-to-face to online, there were new activities that were added, but they were all possible because it ultimately helps to improve the student learning outcomes. And oftentimes, yeah, you bring in new experts. I would say more than taking the time to learn ourselves. Maybe there are others out there. Oftentimes. Emily's talking more about, at the local community level, but there are local experts, local think tanks, homegrown think tanks that we often bring as partners to find those solutions.
Thank you. So my panelists know that I have 2 other questions, but I love it when audience asks questions. So Edwin has asked, on governance and governance systems, the continuity of projects is subject to the ruling political party's discretion. As people who do this on a day-to-day basis, how do you reconcile this reality with your work? And Deidre has jumped on the chance to respond to this. So Deidre.
Diana, partly because Edwin and I have had these discussions. And I recently, worked for 6 years on a project in Ghana. And, given that it's, as I mentioned before, it's about a 3-year development process. And then we have about a 1-year prep process and then 5 years for implementation. So I was there throughout the entire prep, the development process, and then prep, and then the beginning of implementation. And we went through 3 presidents and 5 ministers of energy. And so you are developing and doing we talked about kind of the root cause analysis and starting to move toward the solutions with one set of people in power. And and that's why it's important to consult broadly, because so it's not just a government project, that there are other stakeholders are involved. But at the end of the day, at least for our programs, they are international treaties. It's U.S. government to the national government, and the Minister of Finance is usually signing off on this. And so that party that's in power, kind of what they see as important is often, I won't say necessarily carry the day, but it definitely has a major influence. So then what happens when you have a new minister? It could be the same party, or maybe there's an election and you have a different party in place. You can't go back and renegotiate everything because you have a program to deliver. And so we often have a very difficult job, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I mean, we've sometimes dropped whole projects and activities from compacts because we weren't able to come to an agreement with the new government or the new people in power that the direction that was charted by their predecessors is the right direction to go. And so even though you have technical level folks at these ministries that often you're dealing with, and they're great and they know technically what to do, they still have to answer to their minister. And so it is very difficult. So I would say that, the main thing, Edwin, is we try and get as much buy-in as possible from non-government actors, talking to them in the beginning, making sure we have public-private boards for our compact development process, and then also the unit in country that's made up of country nationals, that board as well, and it has public and private representation, that we make sure that when we sign the document and a new government comes in, that, part of my job in Ghana when there was a change in power, is to meet with all of the different actors in the new government and talk with them about the program and help them understand kind of the evolution. But at the end of the day, we don't have an anti-politics machine, which is actually one of my favorite books on development, but in that we can't just flip a switch and then, politics and the dynamic that goes along with it goes away. And I've been talking about our counterpart countries, but working for a U.S. government organization, that's also, it also impacts my organization in terms of what is important, what we should be focused on. And, and it's not that more recently, a lot of our work that's focused on climate change has really been highlighted, encouraged, and we've been really, our leadership has said, hey, we need to do more on climate change. Whereas before, we still did some of the work, but frankly, it was just more kind of kind of quiet. It wasn't highlighted. So you have to deal with the governance and the governance issues here in the US and then also in the counterpart countries. So I don't have a solution for you, but that's just one of the issues.
Well, and I want to point out too, MCC, her organization was founded on a bipartisan basis, because the case to creating MCC was grounded in the fact that everyone could get behind the justification for establishing it. So the same thing goes for programmatic work. You can find reasons and things that the politicians can get behind and agree upon. That's the case you can make. And I will say this too, you still will find moral challenges to your career path, everyone, but you have to decide what you're willing to pursue and give up and do. So panelists, let me pick up on the third question that you're prepared to answer, which is, at what point does iterative implementation and adaptation turn into navel gazing, which is my favorite saying? When does it have a negative impact on the work you're trying to focus on? When do you know enough is enough? We don't need to do this anymore. Michael, I'd love to invite you, because I know you and I already had a conversation about this.
The opening initial in the acronym that we've deployed, problem-driven iterative adaptation, is on being problem-driven, right? And so if you look at the book and the toolkit and all the things that we've developed around this idea, this set of practices, it's really, after you get the authorization to do this, it's then centered very explicitly and intentionally around being problem-driven, not ideological conformity, not doing the bidding of any particular set of interests. It's around solving a problem. Effective organizations are just problem-solving machines. They're just incredibly good at doing that. I was, a few years ago, I was on a panel doing a version of this with a guy from the National Transport Safety Board, right? And these are the people that fly in after a crash, but even after some relatively minor thing has occurred, right? And it was just, I kind of knew this in principle, but just seeing this, what a organization whose job it is to be relentlessly forensic on understanding all the details about why something can go wrong, and in the case of airplanes, obviously have catastrophic outcomes sometimes when those problems become manifest. It's just amazing. And then there was a guy from NASA there talking about how you put rockets on Mars. And it's just amazing. And speaking of Mars, I think that's one of my favorite conclusions to a movie is the movie The Martian. And if you've seen that movie with Matt Damon as the star guy who survives on Mars for all this time, and the final scene is him standing before all these awestruck new recruits who are about to join NASA. And of course, the obvious question to him is, so how did you survive? How did you make it through all this time? And his beautiful PDIA answer is, I solved one problem, then I solved the next one. And I knew that if I kept solving problems, I'd eventually get home. Now, my work is done. Right? That's it, right? So you don't get caught in navel gazing. Your job is to solve a problem, and you go through that iterative adaptive process until you solve the problem. That's your metric of success. Have we solved the problem that we thought we were going to solve? And that could be a really seemingly small, trivial, inadequate little problem in the grand scheme of things, but that's what the National Transport Safety Board type of work entails, finding these seemingly obscure things that suddenly become the weak link in the chain, and then the whole plane crashes and falls out of the sky. So, and at least in that case, you're dealing with physics and you're dealing with the weather. Like, all the stuff we're talking about here is just dealing with people, and people are way more complicated than the weather and way more complicated than an airplane. We just and you've got to have a structure in place that enables you to accommodate all of that. So that actually extends to, and it's the answer to Edwin's question as well. I mean, you're in the business of trying to solve problems, and you've got to pitch it that way so that different administrative systems see it as such, and not just the overt ideological pet project of the preceding party. So in a book I did a few years ago on public service transformations in East Asia, we had a really great case from Indonesia of them completely transforming their public financial administrative systems, right? They were in the post-Suharto period. they had this big opportunity to recognize that, pencil and paper forms of administering a country of 200 million people just simply wasn't going to be adequate. So yes, there was this big technology issue, but how do you actually help a country of 200 million people engage with a whole entirely different administrative apparatus? And that took 17 years to complete that project, right? Across 5 different national elections, well, not all points on the political spectrum, but different enough that any shameless political creature coming into that space would instinctively want to say, whatever the previous party did was BS. We're going to do it our way because our way is better, and da 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 da. And it's just a really interesting case of how everybody conceded right from the get-go. This was a 20-year project, essentially. It wasn't ever realistic to think it could be done in 5. By its definition, therefore, it's going to transcend different electoral cycles. It's got to go with endure parties with different priorities. But nonetheless, geez, they hung in there. They got it done. And that's just a really nice case, as much as that we have all manner of cases where people desisted, someone retired, someone left, someone got fired, and the whole house of cards came down. But that's politics. That's development. That's a bit bitterly disappointing when that happens. But that you're signing up for that kind of work when you do development. And if you treat it though as a problem to be addressed up front, and you are intentional about that, then you're doing your job. And if that doesn't work, it doesn't work. But at least you've recognized it as the problem it is, and you've framed it as such, and you've built out an apparatus to help get a better answer to that than might happen otherwise. You got to make your peace with that. That's the best you can do.
Rajani, would you like to address this question of how do you know when enough is enough?
Yeah. From a implementer or practitioner perspective, it's interesting choice of words from your side, Diana. When you said navel gazing, I was actually thinking something we've discussed within the team also. And sometimes our M&E teams often tell me, like, you've done all of these adaptations, but you haven't documented. And I'm like, I could not care about documentation right now. I need to implement and show results. But for me, the way I see it, I don't see it about frequency. I don't know, when you say enough is enough, I don't see iterative implementation and adaptation as like about frequency as it is about the context, the timing, the method, and the relevance. So, in terms of the context, are we doing it when there is no foreseeable changes in the external environment? So for Lebanon, because we were in a situation of so much change, so much of the external environment was influencing our project's activities and success, that we know we had to create and develop this adaptive management framework. Was the timing right? Had the shift in the external environment already happened? Now, to give you an example from another country, from Myanmar, it's something, our team was diving into the scenario planning process, that the scenario planning process really is at the heart of our adaptive management framework. But then, the timing was not right. The coup had already happened. Here we are really talking about salvaging the project. What can we do? It's not really about, okay, you can pivot. There was no time, it had already happened. Is it the method? Someone was talking about, how do we get all these stakeholders on the same page? There's so much the political influence that happens. So, are you doing your iterative planning on your own, or are you bringing the right people in the room? It could be internal stakeholders. A project like Kitabi, the Lebanon project, has 150 staff across 5 different organizations. We are working with the public sector. We have the donor. So we really need to make sure. So when we created our framework, we had the donor in the room. We didn't have the ministry, but we are hoping over time we will work with the ministry on this as well. And then the main thing is, is it relevant for the project? And I think this is where the role of the leaders come in, to just really make sure that there is no mission creep. You're really focused on the goal. So adaptation is really not the means and not the end. So. But sometimes, it can lead to mission creep. So really thinking about, those are the things that come to mind. So I don't know, enough is enough, but more about like the method and the approach you're taking to do the adaptation.
Yeah, well said. Agree fully. Emily, would you like to respond?
So a couple of things we think about how much is enough.
Emily, you get to unplug your earplugs again.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I apparently headphones. So a couple of things we think about how much is enough is enough. Are you talking to exactly the same people you were talking to before? Are you going to learn something that you didn't already know? And are you going to do something that you weren't already planning to do? And if you can't answer yes to all three of those questions, it's really not worth it. Right? Like if you can't answer yes to something will be different because of this, then save yourself the meeting, save yourself the process, save yourself writing the report. It's going to be the same report that we wrote 5 years ago or that the World Bank or MCC wrote 5 years ago. What are you adding to the conversation? What is the next piece of the problem that you're solving? And that's a really hard question to ask yourself at the beginning of launching a process, because we get really excited about launching the process and we get, this is how you do things and this is what you do. And you run through the cycle sometimes without really interrogating it. And this is how, Michael keeps talking about the 3 T's. This is how it's done. Well, if how it was done fixed things, we wouldn't still be doing it. So those are some of the questions that we ask ourselves. And it's hard sometimes to get there. And also you have to make sure that you're not setting yourself a horizon that's impossible to meet. So have we solved poverty? That's CARE's mission statement, is to solve poverty. Is that a problem I'm going to fix at the end of this conversation, at the end of this week? Absolutely not. What is the piece of the problem that we're going to solve today? If this is something we know has a 20-year horizon, how will we know 6 months from now if we're on the right track? We won't know if it worked or not, but we will probably have an idea if we're like close to the right direction or if we're way off base. And so how do you think about those touch points closer in and examining the problem in smaller chunks while you are thinking about a longer horizon, about how do these pieces build on each other? And if suddenly one of the dominoes gets knocked out, then what happens? And so those are some of the ways we try to think about when is enough enough. Although I will say we do not always land on the right side of that conversation. I think we've all been in writing the report or having the meeting or having the stakeholder process, and you're halfway in and you're like, oops, this was not the most constructive way to spend these resources. So if you can stop then, sometimes, calling it early on helps. And sometimes you can't. Sometimes you've already launched a process and, you just have to own that and try to get better next time.
Yeah, my favorite is strategic planning for the sake of strategic planning and saying you did strategic planning when in fact you will still continue to deliver on your organizational mission goals the same way you've been doing. Deidre. No, sorry, go ahead, Emily. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that's a question every time we launch a process or we launch a new initiative. The question I always ask is, what do you need staff to do differently now that we weren't doing before? And if we don't have an answer to that question, then we shouldn't be rolling anything out. Like if there isn't a this is what will happen now that wasn't already happening, then we can skip that part. Sorry, Deirdre, over to you.
No, it's okay. Thanks, Emily. I like the way that Emily framed the question in the beginning in terms of like, are we going to know any new information? Has anything, we're going to learn anything new? Is there anybody we didn't talk to? I think those are really important questions, and that I know that we try and ask ourselves. Frankly, sometimes we also have to look at election cycles as well. And so if you've conducted this exercise, usually we start our processes in January because countries are selected the prior December. And so if the country has an election, let's say later in the year, then you recognize that you probably do need to at least wait to wrap up the conversation until you've got those new folks, if there is a new group of folks in place, to make sure that their views are being brought into the process. So one of the things that helps with us is that countries are often, eager to move to designing the program and then signing the agreement so they can get the money and start. And so although there is this desire a lot of times to like really dig in and understand and analyze and look at it from different points of view, there often is kind of a built-in, at least for our process, a built-in, let's say, push to get to the design phase so you can sign your compact and start implementing. One of the things that is a challenge for us is sometimes the reason why we really get involved into the analysis phase is that when we write our grant agreement, there's a certain level of detail that we need to have in order to be able to set the budget and the M&E plan and all of the things that are, key components of our grant agreements. And so there's a sense of, I need more data, I need more analysis. And so we're also trying to deal with that in implementation, because sometimes we don't have the flexibility in implementation to change things as we do in design, because it's an international treaty. And so we're looking at designing, looking at other types of approaches to design to implement our projects, such as results-based financing approaches, where MCC, instead of saying, we're going to do this exact thing to solve the problem, instead agree on an outcome, and then allowing our country counterparts and organizations in the country to determine how they're going to get there with how they're going to achieve that outcome, and then get that payment. It's still fairly new for us, but we've seen where we tried to, kind of Michael mentioned before, kind of use the 3 Ts, for instance, to design a utility reform program where we, maybe bring in new software systems and experts to do training on how you can maximize customer collections and so forth, with frankly, some mixed and disappointing results. And then, in a country we recently did a program with in Sierra Leone, we decided to use a more results-based approach, where the utility knew that they agreed these were the, for instance, the collections or the connections goals, outcomes they wanted to meet, and that we gave them the flexibility to decide how they were going to meet those outcomes, meet those objectives, in order to get the payment. So we're trying to find ways that we can, avoid the navel gazing, but at the same time build in some flexibility to our implementation process, so we don't get so hung up in the in the back and forth and the navel gazing of trying to get the design just right. And the jury's still out. So these are ways that we've tried to look at this, and it's a work process.
I mean, I think too, everyone would agree, there are often guardrails that funders set up for how programs should run, and the guardrails are often provided by legislative bodies like Congress, imposing rules on how USAID and MCC operate and how the funding that they give to the World Bank should be used in some cases. And those guardrails are meant to protect, but they often limit and cause chaos and frustration and impede progress and success. And so I think too, there's a whole nother subculture of just understanding how to operate in this environment too, that limits iterative implementation and adaptation beyond politics. So sorry for that digression. So audience, I only have one more question really for our panelists. So if you don't have any other questions, we can end early, perfectly fine. But the final question I have is, how can we as individuals be open to doing this effectively? I think we all agree that we want to, and it's good and meaningful, but as humans, we're imperfect. So how do we know what we can do to make this better, and what can we as individuals and organizationally, what can we do to incorporate best practices and approaches into this process? Rajani, if you'd like to start.
Sorry, I was on mute. So looking at it from an institutional and an individual level, I think at an institutional level, just allowing that flexibility to introduce iterative planning in the organization process. Now, in our case, like you said a little while ago, Diana, there are these restrictions, and sometimes, from the donor community, if they don't embrace this fail, it does limit, and it doesn't flow down to the practitioner level or the implementer level. So, just allowing that flexibility. And in our case, for the Lebanon project, the way the instrument is written by USAID, it's very nimble, and it's broad. I've been working in the Lebanon project from 2013, and it wasn't written like that before. It's very recent, and it does allow us to adopt the USAID's collaborating, learning, and adapting approach. And so, because at an institutional level, AID had written an instrument like that, I think that really allowed us to have a framework in the first place. Otherwise, like in the past, it's been, we do adaptive management or iterative planning, but it's more organic. It's not like I talked about earlier, it's not structured, and it isn't as proactive as we would like. So I think that at an organization institution level would be important. And again, instituting this buy-in from the top leaders, and the ones that make or break the project. So, oftentimes we have conversations about, is it the technical that really makes a project successful, or is it more like your ability at the country level to navigate those political intricacies with the ministry? So, the connective tissue in our framework, at least, is the strong relationship with the funder, with USAID and the ministry. So, having that buy-in, because yes, even if we at a project level we did all this iterative planning, if we cannot, unless we have the ministry buy-in and they own that the pivot or the adaptation, we will not be able to implement and do any of the activities. So I think that's another thing. And then the third thing that I can think of is transparency, and the transparency, just trying to build this culture of nurturing that relationship both with your internal stakeholders. In our case, it's a big consortium, and then the external, which is the ministry and the not just the central ministry, really. I'm really talking about ministry, the regional offices at the school level, teachers and principals with whom we work. And then at an individual level, how do we make our staff or team, or how do we ourselves become reflective practitioners? And for me, at least, based on my experience, having, in our project gone through a really participatory process of creating that framework, has made our team very, reflective practitioners, where each one is creating like mini scenario planning for their own deliverables or within their practice areas. And I do think, organizations can invest in change management, emotional intelligence, programs of training programs like that really build the soft skills of the team so that they can be reflective practitioners.
Yes, agree wholeheartedly, having taken some of that training myself many years ago. Deidre, if you're still there, and you'd like to talk a little bit about how we can do this.
So speaking personally, it's interesting, as you asked, when I saw the question, I think maybe it was Michael that mentioned this, that really understanding your role when it comes to to these programs. And in myself, I've kind of reflected, having been at MCC for a long time, 16 of the 17 years we've been around, is seeing myself as more of a midwife, of a process. And when countries become eligible, and back before I was in finance, investment, and trade, as Diana mentioned, I was a country director for many years, for about 12 years, in a couple of different countries, and not just coming in and saying, I have this expertise, and empower, I have this expertise, and developing, our grant programs and so forth, bringing that to the table, but really listening deeply and understanding the problems of the country and what solutions according to the people who are going to have to live with what we do. And so more so seeing myself as being able to bring resources, some intellectual resources, and then of course monetary resources, but really kind of stepping back and being more of a kind of a midwife of a process and a project. So, just reflecting at a personal level, that's one of the things that I've learned, and then also learning to let go, because I've when you think something should be a certain way because you've lived with it for a couple of years in design, but as it starts to implement and it goes a different way, being able to say, maybe it's not the way that I would have done it, but if it's still within our objectives and our parameters and frankly the compact and national treaty. So that's why we try not to write them too detailed. And it's going to achieve the objectives and make life better for the people in the country, then it's not about my way. It's about, the way that it would work. So it's just, I found it's taken a lot of humility on my side, and a lot of and maturity, over the last, decade and a half to recognize that my, the role that I should play in this process, and be okay with the limitations and not to be right.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, I agree with that. I like the midwife analogy, and maybe some of you have seen the always wonderful BBC TV shows called Call the Midwife, right? It's all about the evolution of this practice, which was halfway between sort of just an organic indigenous process and the formal apparatus of public health and medicine, right? So midwifing is a nice sort of hybrid interim space for thinking about this stuff. You can't do much as an individual, I've discovered in development, but you can at least be consistent. You can at least practice what you preach, so to speak, in your own life and in the way you think about these things. And I think it's just we should treat the answer to the question you've just posed, Diana, as itself a problem. Like, and if this iterative thing is right, then you should be able to apply it to that kind of challenge, and it should, in its own way, generate something that looks a little better than what you might have got otherwise. And if it doesn't do that, then you go back to what you're doing. We often say that PDIA is sort of a perpetual second word. It's not a first word in the sense that it claims to have discovered some eureka breakthrough intellectual thing that's going to win prizes or anything stupid like that. And it's not the last word. It's not the QED. It's not like we've nailed it. We've got the proof and a formula and it's been verified mathematically and thus it is true with a capital T. It's the perpetual second word. So I think that's that sort of mindset about how you're thinking about this. I think that's what you can do sort of as an individual. But beyond that, you do everything in development as part of a team, and all of us on this meeting has different types of skills, different types of ways in which their comparative advantage can be optimally exploited in the world. And mine's a very quirky, weird set of skills. Nobody else should be trying to do what I do. It's too weird. But there are people who can actually run workshops on PDA for weeks at a time who are just magnificent at what that facilitating, filling out the fishbone diagram stuff. It's just I just love watching other people do that. I have a colleague who does this with in Mozambique with illiterate women, right? So they can't fill out a fishbone diagram with lots of words because they can't read words. So they've got to do it all pictographically, right? And we're looking at a fishbone diagram done pictographically, just magic, I think. I can't do that, and I shouldn't try to do that. But someone who knows how to do that and knows how to combine sort of a vernacular language spoken, in this case by women trying to set up small businesses in Maputo, they have a very clear in their minds understanding of what the problems are that they confront. They're not maybe what a business consultant flying with an MBA would think it's like, wouldn't articulate it that kind of way. But if you're taking this approach seriously, then you've got to engage with other people's understandings of their problems and their own prioritization of their problems, because they may, again, those might not accord with what some outsider might think. So most of it comes back to being consistent morally and intellectually with everything we're saying here. And then this other sort of deeper strategic point we have called go with the love, which basically says, do what we're doing now. When we teach this in an executive ed classes at the Kennedy School, for example, someone goes through that process, like someone in Cambodia says, wow, this could be really great for what we're trying to do in Cambodia. And so then you get asked to design out this whole system, and the person who's overseeing that from the World Bank now is somebody that I hired 15 years ago to work on justice reform projects. I mean, it's just, you've got to persist with this long enough for the ecosystem to evolve around it. That then makes it possible to think in this way. It means it's possible to speak this way, and then it's become possible to do it this way. And you've just got to be in it long enough to have that space mature enough. I'm sitting on this call because a former student of mine invited me to be here with you. So all of that has a system to it if you dig deep enough and understand the mechanisms that produced it. And I just show up. I just do what I do, and you should show up and do what you do, and you then wager that somehow that adds up to something that is a little better than what was there otherwise. I think that's reasonable, but I think it's just hard to keep believing that when what you do happens to be quirky or seemingly wildly inadequate to the challenge and the scale of the problem at hand.
And grad students, I feel like if I could, I'd give that message to you and why I so strongly commit my time to GRID and the work that you all contribute to that, because you don't know it yet, but you have a lot to add when it comes to creating value at Purdue and getting the graduate student population more involved in the work that GEPP is trying to support. So just show up and do what you do. That's all I ask. Okay, Emily, if you could bring us home on the question at hand.
Yeah. Go on. Did I get the audio right this time?
Yes, yes.
All right. So a couple of things. One, I would say the most important skill you can possibly cultivate is listening. Learn how to listen. Learn how to listen to people who don't look like you, who don't think like you, who don't sound like you. The farther away they are from the you are used to, the more important it is to listen. And we often have the narrative of, well, we've got to give people a voice. That's nonsense. People have a voice. We have to build the tools to listen to their voices. They don't need me to give them a voice. They have one. They need me to listen to it. So how do we do that? And how do you build that in a way that's real and that you're going to act on it? Not just, okay, now I listened and I'm going to do what I was always going to do. I'm going to change something about the way this worked. And I might have to go up against somebody who's powerful. There was a comment in here about, well, what about when donors don't want you to do it? All you can do is ask. But if you never say anything because you're afraid they'll tell you no, you've missed the chance. You've failed. So there are going to be times where you have really uncomfortable conversations, where you have really uncomfortable moments that it didn't work the way you thought it would. Get used to that. Get comfortable being uncomfortable. Awkward is a part of life. You're going to have to do it. I would also say learn to be patient. I was a Peace Corps volunteer a million years ago. And the first thing they tell you, or they told us as Peace Corps volunteers, you're not going to be able to do anything for 6 months. You came out of a freshly minted college degree. You think you know what's going on. I promise you, you don't. Be quiet for 6 months. Don't try to do anything. Just get used to the people, listen to what's going on, and then talk to them about what they want to see. And coming fresh out of college, that sounded nuts to me. I was like, 6 months? What am I going to do for 6 months? 6 months is optimistic. Things take a long time. At CARE, we just did a study of our most impactful innovations. On average, 17 years from very first idea and funding to something happening where it could reach more than 1 million people. 17 years. It takes longer than you think it will. And we weren't doing exactly the same thing for 17 years, right? We were iterating and advancing and adapting and testing in a new context. Get used to the idea that it's not going to get fixed tomorrow. And I think that's something that we've actually done ourselves a real disservice when we talk about, okay, the transformation to digital and the idea of big data. And Google knows before the hospital does if there's going to be an outbreak of food poisoning based on the searches that are happening in a particular area. We've tricked ourselves into believing that this is instantaneous, and it's not. And so how do you pull that back, and how do you reset expectations? We're not going to reach 1 billion people tomorrow with our tool. And that's the other big thing. The world is not waiting for our genius solution. They're not waiting for the one innovator who invents the one widget that's going to solve poverty. If that were the problem, we'd have solved poverty by now. Right? The world has a lot of problems that we have to work on. And so don't be the hammer in search of a nail. And it's easy to trick yourself into this. And I've caught myself doing it over time with my career, that you get excited about something and you've seen that it works and you've seen it work in a couple of places. And suddenly it's the answer to everything. Don't be the hammer in search of the nail. Look at the problem in front of you. So those are some of the big ones that I would go with.
Thank you. In our final few minutes, let's take the last audience question that I see here. George, the head of our GEPP office, he just said he loves the hammer and nail analogy. He's used it with us. So Edwin asked, could any of you please speak to the participatory process that your organizations use in your work, if that exists? Do local people have a chance to participate in the design process beyond testing phase? Emily, please.
I can speak to that a little bit. And there's variable, right? CARE runs at any given time 1,300 projects in 100 countries around the world. So I'm not saying everybody does this perfectly. We've got places to improve. One of the things that we've seen really works is by saying, what is the action plan that this group of stakeholders, sometimes it's a savings group, sometimes it's several communities getting together with government stakeholders, what's the action plan that they want to see happen? And how do we provide money to make that happen? So one of my favorite stories is pretty recent, coming out of Uganda. South Sudanese refugees in Uganda had been saying for years that the food distribution point was too far away. They had to walk a long way. They had to carry heavy bags of food home. They needed the food, but it was putting them at risk. It was really hard to do. It was taking an enormous amount of time. And so we were working on a care project, and they said, look, we don't want you to bring us food. We want you to help fix the problem in the distribution system that already exists. So we gave them a little bit of money, and there was a little bit of training, and we sort of helped to do this midwife thing with an action planning process. And they organized a strike, and they wrote letters to the UN, and they went to the distribution points and sat down and refused to take food, all on their own organizing power. And the UN changed the way they were doing food systems, right? That's the power of what's possible when you move beyond this idea of you're going to participate in my process, you're going to help test so that I have the right answer, and say, how do we support you to get to your own answer?
Anyone else want to respond to that? Michael? Or Rajani, please. Yes, Rajani.
No, I was just going to say, as the previous speaker was talking, I was reflecting, how does this whole participatory process in education, how does it look? And I think it really depends on the context too. I'm from Nepal, and, so I think in theory, there used to be, people would say participatory process, but how much of it was really participatory? I questioned it myself, when I was working in the development sector there. Now in Lebanon, because I work with at the ministry level, at the central ministry level in Lebanon, you have to make sure that the ministry folks, if it trainers or curriculum writers are all part of the process. You cannot write something sitting here in DC and take it down to the field and see, and there will be no uptake. So there's a lot of co-creation process and collaborating process and co-development process with the ministry. The part where I feel sometimes is how can you get it down to the teacher level? Because we work at the central ministry level, sometimes that's where we are focused because of the way it's structured. But sometimes I feel like we need the voices from the field, like the real teachers and the principals from the schools, if they could be part of these, if you're writing training plans and all. And we in World Learning are really trying to see, how can we get that? And it may not be perfect data, but how can we make sure that we can collect information from the teacher level too? So I think the whole participatory process, this word has been there for so long, and I think all donors use it, but I think it really depends on the context and also how strong the ministry is in each of these countries, and whether, who needs them. Does the donor need the ministry, or the ministry need the donor? Yeah.
Michael.
As an extension of that, I think for me, the principle that we're trying to get at here is upholding the legitimacy of the change process, right? And what this space that in English we call participation, what that looks like and feels like, and what then constitutes that thing called participation being part of a legitimate change process. I think that's the big challenge about how to structure it. And that for an organization like the World Bank, or for any government, national government in particular, that by definition means you're trying to function at scale. And you've got to function at scale. There have to be these formal rules. There have to be the guardrails, as you called them before, Diana. You can't. It's not anything goes, right? You can't have that. That's just a recipe for a different kind of disaster. But the magic is trying to figure out what are your universal principles that you're going to work with, and those have to be codified in some particular way. But then you have to have a space that enables the idiosyncrasy of this thing we then call context to be able to find the way in which all of these different problems and all the different kinds of solutions to them can be elicited. So I came to this, the very first thing I ever did with the World Bank, first ever mission I went on was to Indonesia, was to look at this, at the time, very big and innovative system of trying to transform local governments in the aftermath of the fall of the Suharto government. So the problem that everybody agreed upon at a meta level was we were an autocratic country, now we're a proto-democratic country. No adult in Indonesia has any lived experience of what that concept called democracy actually looks like. How can we design a development intervention that can begin to build out those skills of participation, but in an Indonesian way, not just in a New England town hall kind of way, or whatever other model in our heads we had of what participatory democracy might look like. And it's a longer story. We did a whole book on this, but it was just the key part of all that, and what then became the beauty of it and the limit of it was how the Indonesian government, and then in partnership with the World Bank, designed something that's universal enough that it can and be strong enough administratively to have billions of dollars go through it without leaking like a sieve, and yet be nonetheless able to do the work of accommodating idiosyncrasy, of being able to accommodate the very particularities of a country as religiously, ethnically, and in every other way linguistically diverse as Indonesia. And so this class of intervention is called community-driven development now. That's an administrative category at the World Bank, but it's a particular way of structuring these. But how that class of interventions manifests itself in the Philippines and Cambodia and Afghanistan is different enough that those details really matter. And you can't just cut and paste it from one context to another. You've got to go through something like a PDA process to figure out, okay, well, how do we turn this into something that looks and feels Cambodian when it's in Cambodia? And how does it feel and look Afghan when it's functioning in Afghanistan? So that's the hard work of development. And again, in a world in which we're deeply incentivized to just put ourselves in fancy planes and fly around the world telling people what to do about it, because you can get paid a lot of money to do that and feel great and feel useful and feel smart and important. And great, there are certain problems in the world that look like that. There's just a heck of a lot of them that just do not look like that, for which thinking that way itself is part of the problem. And you've got to have a different headspace for doing all of that. So that's always been the problem. But that characterization of it has been well understood for many generations and in development. Not just Albert Hirschman and a whole bunch of people before that. Every generation comes up with this epiphany about, oh my God, why are we doing it this way? And yet we're still having these kind of conversations. We're still the fringe of development because the structures we work within just can't accommodate it. And that's for me, and what I spend my life agitating around is, how do we design a better operating system? We're just trying to load up a better piece of software and think that's going to crack the code, as Emily said before. We need a whole different operating system for dealing with this stuff. And I don't know how to do that, but someone out there does. And or at least that's a generational task that maybe technology will enable some of this to be done in a better way. But they're going to build on that. My job is to get enough of those people in their room so that together they then collaboratively figure out how to do that.
Well, thank you. Thank you to our panelists for spending time with us today. We're right at the 12:30 mark, actually 12:29. So I want to remind all of you to join us for the last panel taking place tomorrow and the final day of the expo on Friday. If you have any questions, please let Rhonda, Han, or I know, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you again, panelists.